share some stories here this morning about peacemakers. He's from Goshen. His wife is currently in seminary there, and I don't think there's anything else that I missed. So Dave, why don't you come up here and we'll pray for you here before you start. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your good news that is being made known all around the world. We thank you for your peace that you offer to each and every one of us. As we continue to celebrate your resurrection and the peace that you offer to us, may we be instruments of your peace in our world. May we be inspired this morning as we hear about ways in which people are looking for your peace around the world.
Thank you so much for having me here. Can you all hear me? Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for listening. I graduated. Is there a ringing in the background? No. Is there something I can do about that? I have fond memories of graduating from Eastern Mennonite High School 10 years ago. And at that time, I remember a not too serious rivalry with Christopher Dock's choir at Eastern Mennonite High School. And I hope that that's continuing and remaining amicable. If we could begin the PowerPoint. Also, is that ringing still around or not? As John said, I'm here today to tell a few stories that are meaningful and interesting in my life, beginning with the stories of my great aunts, Ada and Ida Stoltzfus, who came from the middle west of here, Church, and then a story of one of their students named Sadi Hoffman from Arab, Israel, Palestine, and then the story of Nima Bowie, Liberia. Let's go to the first slide. Ada and Ida Stoltzfus, as I mentioned, were born into the community at Conestoga Mennonite Church. They grew up there. They went to Eastern Mennonite College at that time, many decades ago, where they both, I believe, studied nursing. After college, they came back to the community in Conestoga. They taught in a one-room Amish schoolhouse for several years. They taught together. They worked together their whole career long. One year, all of their students at the Amish one-room schoolhouse were also named Stoltzfus. It was a very Stoltzfus-centric crowd. Next slide. They accepted a call to serve with Mennonite Central Committee in India for 5 years. This was a very painful and difficult time in India. It was when India and Pakistan were breaking apart. Hundreds of thousands of people were refugees, were needing to go away from their homes to another country because of their ethnic and religious backgrounds. Ada and Ida delivered aid work. They coordinated Mennonite relief efforts to India, and they related with many different people who they met there. Next slide. They accepted another call, beginning through Mennonite Central Committee, but becoming its own ministry, to serve in Palestine. This was also at a very difficult time in Israel-Palestine. There had just been a major war. Many people had needed to abandon their homes. Many Palestinian Arabs left their villages. And Ada and Ida moved to the city of Hebron, where they began an orphanage and a school. They stayed in Hebron and continued serving there for 37 and a half years. They made most of their careers there. They never married. They had 1,200 children live with them over the course of that time. 1,200 children stayed with them, studied with them, and they had many other students in the local community there come in for school. And they named their school the Mennonite School. I later heard it said about them that men would never have been able to do what they did because they were women and were unthreatening. They could come in and name a Christian school in a community that was almost 100% Muslim, an overwhelmingly Muslim community. And their school developed a very positive reputation. One day, or one week, there was a new imam, a Muslim pastor equivalent, who came into the community, and he said on the announcements one week, "Don't send your children to the Mennonite school. They'll try and indoctrinate them and brainwash them into becoming Christian." And there were so many parents that came in and complained to the imam and said, "This Mennonite school is wonderful. It's offering a wonderful education, and these women care deeply for our children." But the next week he went up and said, you can send your children to the Mennonite school. It's a good school. We should all treat our children the way they treat the children there. So the school developed a very positive reputation. Next slide. One of their students was named Sadi Othman. When Sadi's 6, Sadi's father died in an electrical accident, and his mother wasn't able to take care of him. She sent him to the orphanage and to the school to live with my great aunts. And they made a wonderful impression on him. He then went to a Mennonite high school, also in Hebron. And after that, he went to Heston College, a school where he had a wonderful experience out in Kansas and built bonds and a sense of community that have lasted the rest of his life so far. You can see him pictured here. He's very tall. He's 6'5", I think. Also attended school in Jordan, where he was the first person to dunk a basketball in the country of Jordan. Next slide. Sadi lived in the United States after going to Heston College, and he was a taxi driver in New York on 9/11. He would say later, I was hurt, I was appalled, I was ashamed that the people who committed this attack were fellow Arabs. When the U.S. was preparing to go to war in 2003 in Iraq, Sadi didn't believe it was a good idea. He thought it would be a difficult and long and fruitless endeavor. But he volunteered to go as a translator, next slide, with the U.S. Army because he wanted to help U.S. soldiers and Iraqi civilians and Iraqis to understand each other, to help ease the conflict. He was deployed to the city of Mosul. You can see the center of the city of Mosul in the lower left. That structure that you see is called a tel. A tel is what happens when you have a civilization that uses earthen construction, that builds buildings out of clay in the same place for thousands of years. It's an artificial mountain made out of the ruins of prior buildings. Mosul is the biblical city of Nineveh, so it's a very old city. He was deployed to Mosul, where he was working with U.S. soldiers and Iraqi civilians, helping to translate, helping people to understand each other. And one day, he came out of the bathroom and bumped into a middle-aged man with gray hair and jogging shorts. The man noticed him, and that he was this very tall Arab on the base, and asked him who he was and what his work was, and he explained. And the man said, "How do you think we're doing here in Iraq?" And he said, "I think we're doing very badly. Our soldiers don't speak Arabic. We don't have a good understanding of Iraqi culture and customs. We're not building up the kinds of civil society and relationships that we need for this war to go better." Next slide. And the man said, this was as they were coming out of the bathroom. And the next slide. And the man said, "Well, I'm General Petraeus, and I want you to come be my translator." General Petraeus was at that time commander of all U.S. forces in northern Iraq, 100,000 some troops, but within a year was commander of all U.S. forces in Iraq, the better part of 500,000 troops. And General Petraeus took Sadi Othman on as a close advisor, actually one of 2 pacifist advisors that he had. He also had a British woman who was a pacifist who was close to him. But he took Sadi Othman on, and it was said by media figures that any place you saw one of them, you would see the other, that anything you said to one of them would get to the other. They were very close. General Petraeus used Sadi Othman to negotiate with Turkey after U.S. troops accidentally killed a dozen Turkish soldiers. He sent Sadi Othman to negotiate with Iran, and most importantly, he sent him to negotiate in a movement that was called the Sunni Awakening. This was a movement in which the U.S. was seeking to convince tribal and religious leaders in western Iraq, which up until that time had been the most dangerous area, the area where Al-Qaeda in Iraq had the most forces and people. They were negotiating with leaders to ask them to tell Al-Qaeda that they were no longer welcome, to tell Al-Qaeda people that they had to leave and would not be hosted, given sort of secrecy and comfort. And this was something that Sadi Othman was very good at, and western Iraq remains far more peaceful to this day. Even now, that region, which is not where ISIS has come in, that region is about as peaceful as a typical U.S. city. And it's an amazing change from what it was 15 years ago. Next slide. Sadi Othman was also the primary translator for the U.S., so you can see him here translating for Defense Secretary Robert Gates under Obama and under Bush, and for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, has helped out in the U.S.'s efforts in Iraq. This is a long statement from Fed Secretary Robert Gates about it. Next slide. And Saudi Othman he always brought to this the attitude that he was coming to make peace. He would say later, I came for peace, not for war. And he came and paid homage to my great aunts multiple times at Conestoga Mennonite Church, some of us have roots, and also visited Heston College to give thanks at that community. And I first learned about Saudi Othman in a news magazine interview. The interviewer said, so you've lived in all kinds of places. You studied in Jordan, you lived in Palestine, you lived some in Brazil, you lived in the United States. What do you consider yourself? And he said, well, I had these two teachers who made such an impression on me growing up that I guess I consider myself a Mennonite. And that was how I first learned about his story. Next slide. Going to turn now to another story in another country, another part of the world, to the story of Lima Bowie. Lima was born, next slide, in rural Liberia. This is a country in West Africa. She was severely displaced and traumatized and hurt during the first Liberian Civil War in the early 90s. This was a complex conflict with many different factions. A wide area within the country was sucked up in the war. And she left Liberia as a refugee for some time, a penniless refugee. She begged her way onto a bus to go to Ghana, and then at the end of the war she came back. She volunteered in Monrovia, in the capital, and she worked at a church called St. Peter's Lutheran Church, where she worked a lot with women, especially, and with children who had been traumatized during the war, who had seen terrible things and experienced difficulties. And she was moved by the stories of these women, and was moved to care deeply about the consequences of war. Next slide. She encountered a man who I'm proud to say actually has been supported throughout his career by Mennonite Mission Network, the agency that I work for. She encountered a man named Sam Beatty Doe, who was in charge of the West Africa Network for Peace Building. This was a network in different countries in West Africa designed to put people in communication and equip them with community organizing, with mediation, with the skills needed to try to prevent and to try to stop violent conflicts. Sam introduced her to the work of John Howard Yoder and to some Mennonite theology, which made an impression on her, and also introduced her to practical tools that she would use. Next slide. The Second Liberian Civil War began in 1999. This was a terrible conflict. It was a conflict that claimed several 100,000 lives, so somewhere sort of on the scale of even the Iraq War. It was the sort of conflict that you might point to and say, there's just no way out of this. There are so many factions, the massive use of child soldiers, rebels and different groups entrenched in different areas of the country. You might say, there's just nothing to do here but fight it out, maybe go in and take out the rebel groups. But Lima Bowie felt called to a different group. Next slide. Lima had a vision. She experienced a miracle in her sleep. She heard what she understood to be the voice of God, which told her that she was to gather the women around her and to pray for peace. She and several other leaders began a movement. They brought together women from different parts of the country, from rural and from urban backgrounds, from Christian and from Muslim backgrounds, and from animist backgrounds, people of different tribes and ethnicities. Next slide. And they formed the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace campaign. They did all sorts of things. They held strikes, they held protests and rallies and marches in the streets to obscure traffic. They held petition campaigns. They insisted that politicians come together. For a time, they refused to sleep with their husbands. They worked in every way they could think of to bring international attention and domestic attention to the conflict, and to try to insist that the leaders of the different militant factions in Liberia come together. And they succeeded. Next slide. They brought the many different leaders of different groups together, and once they had them in a hotel, they encircled it and tried to prevent any vehicles from leaving. They tried to trap everyone there to force negotiations. They succeeded. Liberia had a democratic election election and elected Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, modern Africa's first female president. And she has now left the office, and there has been a second peaceful transition of power, just as of a couple months ago. And Lima Bowie's movement was completely successful. Next slide. For which she received the Nobel Peace Prize. Lima Bowie also had studied at Eastern Mennonite University. I have a very small connection with her and my family, which is that my grandma was a totally awesome person who had an department for international students at Eastern Mennonite University for several decades. And Lima was one of the students who stayed there, and my mom managed the apartment. And one day when Lima was speaking at EMU, she saw my mom and said, "Oh, my old aunt lady." So a very small family connection there. But Lima has been very proud of and very nurtured by her connection with EMU as well. And I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about her story, there's a documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell about the efforts to end this conflict. I suggest. Next slide. I'd like to talk about a few lessons that I draw from these stories. One of them is, as we, and I'm using we here, talking about North Americans, and of course I think there are analogous lessons for everyone, but as we think about international work, as we think about work globally, we need to think in terms of championing and of supporting and of empowering global partners. I, as an American, am unlikely to go into another country and end a conflict, or go into another country and make a massive difference in relief work or in health work. But I can partner with people who do. I can partner with people and give resources and encouragement and support to people in other countries and in other places in the United States who make an incredible difference in their own contexts. And it's very important when you're thinking about trying to do good work to think about finding partners, to think about finding and joining the work that God is already doing in other places. Next slide. Another lesson that I draw from these stories is to emphasize, and there are a few pictures here related to the school in Israel-Palestine, to emphasize building up communities and to emphasize holistic mission. To look at mission as something where you're trying to develop people as whole people, educationally, spiritually, in their health, and to emphasize nurturing stronger communities. In the United States, from our foreign policy perspective, we have a perspective that very heavily emphasizes killing our enemies. That's what we spend our federal budget on, our discretionary budget. And that's how we talk about solving our foreign policy problems. And even General Petraeus, even the United States Department of Defense, don't like that, don't want to encourage that. We need different approaches as a nation, and of course in the church, to how we approach resolving conflicts and how we approach trying to make our world a better place. Next slide. And a safer place for all of us. Another thing I would say is to play to your strengths and draw on the full breadth of your community. On this slide, I'm talking very much about my own community, the Mennonite community. It is an increasingly diverse community ethnically. It is certainly a very diverse community theologically. And one thing that I think about often when I tell these stories is that these stories would be completely impossible if the gifts and calling of my great-aunts Ada and Ida, who were women who wore head coverings their whole lives and were very conservative theologically and culturally, if their gifts had not been valued, if they had not been called and sent and honored, none of these stories would have been possible. And these stories would also have been impossible if Sadi Hoffman had not been called and empowered and loved and taught and energized. And he is not engaged in the Mennonite Church even at all. There's a wide spectrum of people who have a lot to contribute to doing God's work in the world. Next slide. Another thing I would say is to think in terms of long-term relationships. At Mennonite Mission Network, where I work, our model traditionally has been to consider people long-term once they've been in the field for 5 years. And that's not how it works anymore. Nowadays, we consider people long-term when they've been in the field for more than 1 or 2 years. But we view our work in terms of long relationships where we can know and trust and understand people and contexts where we're working. And this is very important. For Ada and Ida to be able to do the work that they did, they needed to be there for a long time to build trust and to build understanding and to build relationships and connection. Next slide. Another theme that I see very deeply in these stories is enemy love, which is something that Jesus taught us and that Jesus continues to teach us. As I look at these stories, if Ada and Ida would have cared about stereotypes about Arabs, or if they would have cared about stereotypes about the danger of work in the Middle East, they might never have done their work. This incredible, beautiful thing that that God made possible through them would never have happened. When I think about Saadi Hoffman, if he had said, Iraq war is a stupid idea, we shouldn't be going in, I don't think it's a good idea, I'm not going to go risk getting shot in the face by terrorists because we're making this bad choice, then this never would have happened. But he acted out of love for the Iraqi people, for U.S. soldiers, for everyone involved, and did transformative work out of enemy love, or out of love for people with whom he disagreed, at the very least. And of course, Nima Bowie was someone who facilitated reconciliation, was someone who helped lead a movement that needed an incredible level of forgiveness and understanding. The Civil War in Liberia was one that was full of war crimes. It was a war that was full of child soldiers who were traumatized and who traumatized those around them. And that demanded an extraordinary amount of love and forgiveness for everyone involved to work through. Next slide. And I would finally say to think in terms of following God's call in hardship. I think that we often look in our careers, in our work, in where we want to work and how. We often think in terms of how nice things are, how much money we'll make, how beautiful the place is. And I think Ada and Ida's story is an example of working in a very difficult place. They had arthritis their whole lives. It was terrible. It was cold often. It was physically difficult, but they followed God's call. And I want to invite you to do the same. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.
Thank you, David, for these stories, and I hope that we are inspired as we listen to God's call for our lives here today. Classes begin in 5 minutes.